Commission. Could you call the roll, please?
Chair Suma,
Here.
Vice Chair Chang,
Here.
Commissioner Aiken,
Here.
Commissioner Heckman,
Here.
Before we get started, I wanted to mention something, and that is that we have an item number 3 after our adjournment, which was an informational, had wanted to speak to it. They could do that in the public comment period, which is coming up next. And if anyone shows up at the end of the meeting who wants to speak, we'll try to find a way for them to speak to that item also. But it was really just an informational report and not an agendized item. So thank you very much. And with that, we will move to public comment for items that are not agendized tonight. Do we have any speakers?
I have no request to speak.
Okay, thank you very much. And we will move on to city official reports.
Sorry. My name's John Kelly. I just have a question, which is whether the planning director or anyone else from development services has contacted the PTC about reviewing the impact fees for ADUs. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. Are there any other public speakers at this time?
No.
Okay, thank you. Now we can move on to agenda changes, deletions, and additions.
No changes.
Thank you so much. And then you're up again for city official reports.
Thank you, Amy French, Chief Planning Official. On the screen is, excuse me, are the upcoming Planning and Transportation Commission tentative agendas, as well as the upcoming council agendas that have planning items. So you can see we're going to have a busy end of the year. We have representation at the council. We thank you to Commissioner Aiken on Monday night. He represented planning for the car-free streets, as well as the Ellsworth item, which was not heard and was continued to a date uncertain. And then we have some other items coming up that Planning Commission has reviewed: the housing element implementing ordinances and the Los Trencos home, both of which the Planning Commission reviewed. And then in end of November, we have the rental registry program. Coming up in December, there's the safe parking, which the Planning and Transportation Commission also reviewed, and some other items that are kind of tentative at this point for those dates. And then, of course, later this month with the Planning Commission, we'll have the bike and ped plan update from the Office of Transportation, and we'll be looking at the annual report like we do every year on our progress on the comprehensive plan and housing element. We are targeting December 13th for our study session on the NVCAP. And then we have a couple of action items that may or may not come forward by that point. And of course, next year in January, we have Office of Transportation staff to present.
Thank you. I see that Mr. Rios is here.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Chair and Commissioners. Rafael Rios, Senior Engineer with the Office of Transportation. I have several updates to give, and also wanted to put a reminder out there that the open comment period is still open on the project's website, and they'll be open likely till the end of the month also. Earlier this week at City Council, City Council did approve the Crescent Park neighborhood traffic calming project, which previously came to this committee, as well as the car-free streets for Ramona and updates. Blake Wilbur Drive between Sandhill Road and Welch Road is now open. It opened on Monday. Follow up on the previous Middlefield Road and Lincoln Avenue intersection improvements are currently in work is happening right now. And let's see. And I believe that's all the comments I had. Or follow.
Thank you for that. Commissioners, do you have any questions? Commissioner Templeton?
Thank you very much. Mr. Ruiz, did you want to update
the community about the meeting happening on the 24th about El Camino Real with the city and adjacent cities and the state senator and state assembly member?
Apologize.
Do it if
I'm
you
not-
don't have it handy.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that meeting that's happening, but I'll try to get additional information and share. I don't have.
I'm happy to share. I just think because the city's participating in the meeting, that it would be good to include a meeting hosted jointly between State Senator Josh Becker and State Assembly Member Mark Berman with Caltrans about the upcoming road paving project that will be affecting Palo Alto, Los Altos, and Mountain View. It'll be held Tuesday, November 14th at 11:30 a.m. at the Mountain View Community Center on Rangstorf. There's also a Zoom participation option. You can find information on the website of either the State Assembly member or State Senator. Thank you.
Any other questions, Commissioner Liu?
Related to that meeting, is there any high-level update on the plans for El Camino, potential bike lanes, parking, other changes?
I will follow up with you. I mean, there hasn't been any community process or approvals of anything, but I'll follow up with our planners and try to find out more to share feedback.
I think that would be wonderful, Mr. Ruiz. For now, I think what we can say is that Caltrans, the people that are operating El Camino Real, will be there to answer questions about that and what's happening in our adjoining communities. I believe that's one of the reasons Caltrans was considering bike lanes as an option for Palo Alto, because Los Altos and Mountain View will be getting them. So it'd be interesting to talk to them about our feedback and our process, and just please show up if you can. Then they can get to know what we're looking for community involvement and work with our city. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Any other commissioner comments or questions? Anything else from staff at this time? Okay, thank you then, everyone. We will move on to our study session, which is Tree Protection Ordinance Year 1 Review and Recommendations. So with that, we will move to staff, who I believe has a presentation.
Yes, thank you, Chair and Commissioners. Peter Gollinger, the Urban Forester for the city. Tonight, we're going to be discussing some of the feedback we've received after the first year of ordinance implementation. As you all know, we updated our ordinance in June of 22, and it went into effect in July, and we've spent this last year implementing it. Next slide, please. So the process that we've been following here is the ordinance went into effect in July. In June, we updated city transportation this evening as directed by council when the ordinance was passed in June. In December, we plan to take our findings back to council for further direction on how to proceed, where we expanded the definition of protected trees. We updated the allowable reasons for removal. We focused on the maintenance of private protected trees and trees that are currently protected under the new ordinance. We have several native species, and we protect all mature trees over 15 inches. The trees that were previously protected are the coast live oak. One of the key new changes is the protected tree maintenance instructs them onto the best management practices for maintaining their trees. Next slide, please. There's no fee associated with this. It's just an informational notification. So what we came to talk to you about this evening is that we have some proposed changes. We also think that there's room to make some changes to the allowable reasons for removal. Next slide, please. In regards to updates for clarity, we have some highlights on when the applicant will choose the arborist and when the city would choose the arborist. It was unclear in the existing code. We updated the definition of a designated tree so that it includes both current and previously completed projects, asking projects to disclose. We're also seeking to clarify when a tree removal permit is needed and when a minor staff level AR is needed. moratorium. Next slide, please. So specifically regarding tree disclosure, the existing code is kind of a run-on sentence, and so we've chosen to, regarding tree removal permit and when it's needed, a public works tree removal permit is needed for the removal of a private protected tree on a residential property outside of development. If a tree needs to be removed from anything other than a residential property, it requires a staff level architectural review through the planning department, not through public works. That wasn't clear, and verify that as well. Under the proposed language, 36 months or less could be issued by urban forestry. Anything greater than 36 months would require approval from public works or director of planning and development services. We also want to clarify that completion of any tree mitigation plantings required as part of the permit, please. We also are proposing some updates to the reasons for removal. So outside of development, we'd like to separate detriment to or crowding an adjacent protected tree from impacting the foundation or eaves of a residence. Currently, those are in the same bullet point, which prevents us from using the detriment. A tree is at risk for retrenchment or other tree decline coping process, or it is structurally incompatible with its immediate environment. Now, you may be asking, what is retrenchment? Next slide, please. Setting, it'll begin to die back. Its upper limbs will start to die back and fall off, and it'll basically shrink itself down. It will reduce the overall height, but maintain stability. Now, in a naturalized forest setting, that's a fine thing, but in an urban environment, it's not so great. What is missing in our red line? For reasons for removal as part of a development on a residential lot, we will be proposing to add detriment to or crowding an adjacent protected tree. The new reason for retrenchment or structurally incompatible with its immediate environment. And we're also proposing to add the 25% rule into the code. So the 25% rule is when the tree protection zone of a tree or trees takes up more than 25% of the buildable area on a lot. This has previously been applied to residential projects, but it's never been in the residential portion of the code. So we're seeking to address that oversight. Next slide, please. We're also proposing to update a new reason for removal for non-residential development. Previously, it was understood that under Title 18, we had discretion regarding these larger projects, but a closer reading of Title 18, it's not explicitly granted. So this seeks to resolve that situation. So this would allow us to approve some removals when the ultimate result would increase net tree canopy. Next slide, please. We're also seeking to include an exemption for the excessive pruning. There are some types of tree maintenance that require removal of more than the limit for excessive pruning. These would be trees that would have been maintained as a hedge, trees that have been pollarded. If pollarding is a term you're not familiar with, the photo here are pollarded trees. These are trees that are cut back to the same point every year. Primarily, it's to increase shade. It's usually in a patio setting, or trees that have been trained as an espalier. Next slide, please. So those are the changes that staff is proposing based on what we've seen in this protected trees. We could either eliminate one or more native species, we could change the diameter, or we could update the allowable reasons for removal. Next slide, please. Just as a reminder, where we are regarding the other cities, municipalities around us. Menlo Park protects oaks at 10-inch and all mature trees at 15. East Palo Alto protects all trees at 8-inch. Los Altos mature trees at 15. Mountain View select natives at 4-inch and mature trees at 15. Redwood City, any tree at 12-inch. Sunnyvale, any tree at 12-inch. Atherton, oaks at 15.2. San Carlos, 9-inch, 11-inch. So what we have currently is pretty much in tune with what the rest of the peninsula is doing. Next slide, please. Just as a reminder, these are some of the estimates for the total number of trees in the urban area that we came up with when we were researching the ordinance. We estimate that there's approximately 600,000 total trees in our urban forest. Under the old ordinance, we protected approximately 81,000 of those trees. Under the new ordinance, we're estimating about 225 of those 225,000 are protected. Again, this is an estimate based on a sample size of about 10,000 trees on private property. Next slide, please. Some additional potential actions. In August, the city received a letter regarding our housing element. And one of the things that came to light was that there may be room for improvement regarding our tree ordinance. So these are some potential actions that could be taken. There's a little more detail in the report. This would apply, the proposal for this is that this would apply for projects with 4 or more units. I believe there's some other caveats as well, but we can speak to that when we have the discussion. Next slide, please. And again, why are we doing this? We're doing this because there's a lot of value for us to have trees in our urban environment. Next slide, please. And that's what I have this evening for my presentation. I look forward to discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Gollinger, for that report. And I thought what we do is what we usually do, have a round of clarifying questions. And then we will go to the public and then come back to the commission. And I did want to mention for the record that Commissioner Reckdahl has joined us. So I see Commissioner Aiken and Commissioner Chang in that order.
Thank you, Chair. To clarify, I have a $1 million property and a $100,000 additional project. Is the total project valuation the 100K of the project that's being, the new project that's being applied, or is it the 1.1 million of the existing valuation plus the new?
When we wrote that into the code, I believe it was having to do with the project itself, not the property and the project.
Okay. And second, since you're surveying the trees on private property, one possible reaction to the inclusion of so many new trees would be that property owners might remove trees that, if they grew to sufficient diameter, would become protected. So have we seen any signs of removal of smaller trees in your surveys?
So these surveys were done from data that was collected during the development process. So we have not collected a whole bunch of new data after the ordinance went into effect. Just from a on the ground in the field perspective, there may be some of that happening, but I don't know that it's a large issue.
Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Commissioner Chang?
Thank you so much, Mr. Gollinger, for this report. I loved seeing some of the data there, because it answers all the questions that we so often have on the commission, and then this one actually came with the data. I had a question about what's when you're talking about retrenchment, and but there was also a phrase structurally incompatible. I don't know what structurally incompatible means. Can you help clarify that?
Yeah, that could apply to a couple different situations. Most notably would be a tree that was basically structurally unrepairable. Let's say a tree that has the majority of its limbs over the top of a home, and it can't be maintained or changed to come back to a regular status, but it's not technically a hazard. So there's situations where the trees would be irreparable, but they're not technically a hazard. There's no indication that the tree would fall immediately or in the near future. But because it is so unbalanced or so strangely shaped or so incompatible with its immediate environment, it should probably be removed, but we didn't necessarily have a category for that to fit where we could allow it. So it's an attempt to capture those situations we encountered during the first year where a tree probably should be removed, but it didn't technically meet any of the criteria we have in place.
Thank you. And then my second question is, it's regarding the changes proposed on packet page 10. So it's when you were talking about espaliers the part that's added to the code says that requests need to be made 14 days prior to the pruning. Is that something that needs to be done every single year? Because in the examples that you gave, these are things that are done to trees every single year, or once somebody's doing it, it's clearly established that they're doing this. And presumably if they got the first waiver, they would get every single other waiver. So is that what's the actual implementation that would happen here? Is that party going to have to come every year?
So if it is a protected tree, they would still need to file the maintenance notice, but I think they would only need to apply for the exemption once. So once the exemption was granted, then they would just file their regular maintenance notice, which is just an online form, and we get an email. That way, if we get a phone call, we can look it up and say, oh no, they have a tree company coming to prune it. Don't panic, they're not taking the tree out. We get a lot of those phone calls when people are doing their regular maintenance on their trees and the neighbors are freaking out. So having that list of what's going on helps us answer those questions quickly.
Okay, and so I'm naive about this. Is the clarification for that process in the tree protection manual, or is it like, I'm just wondering where the right place is for it, because I
Yes,
read this and my concern was like, oh no.
So the specifics on the process will be included in the tree technical manual, which assuming we have some additional changes to the ordinance in the few next coming months after this process is complete, we would like to publish the manual immediately thereafter. We're holding off because we may make some additional changes, so we want those to be incorporated into the document.
Thank you.
Commissioner Liu?
Hello, I had a few questions for this round. Can you talk a little bit about the exemptions that other cities applied to their protected trees? I saw fruit trees were included, palm trees were included, eucalyptus/gum. Are palms and eucalyptus already covered by the invasive list? And what's the logic for exempting fruit trees, for example?
So for us, palms are excluded because palms are not technically trees. They're actually grasses, so they're just not even covered at all. So palms are excluded under our ordinance. Eucalyptus are excluded as a high fire danger and an invasive. So those are already covered under our own exemptions. I think some of the other municipalities are including fruit trees because folks may want to remove and replant fruit trees, and they should be able to do that, I think is the whole purpose of that. We have not included fruit trees. We discussed that during our initial passage of the ordinance, but didn't choose to exempt those.
I had a question about the 25% rule. So that covers residential projects, presumably including ADUs and attached ADUs. But I think calculating the buildable area for an ADU is tricky, and it's less clear to me. Like, for example, arguably an ADU could just be attached or take over your garage. And therefore, trees that are otherwise in the way would not actually kind of be in the way because they're alternatives for ADUs. How does the 25% rule work with ADUs?
I don't believe we've ever applied the 25% rule to an ADU. It's been to the overall parcel as a whole. So maybe that's something that we can consider adding into that portion for the residential section. We can definitely discuss that. But it's never been invoked for an ADU. It's only been used for usually small non-standard parcels where a large tree takes up the majority of the property.
I see that our city attorney would like to opine on this.
Yeah, I just want to also note that I think in the last 12 months, we adopted an exception for ADUs as well. So the tree ordinance should not be an impediment to ADU construction.
Thank you. Maybe one last question for this round. Can you talk about the reproduction cost of the tree? That's referenced a few points in the different penalties. And I just lack context into what that would actually look like in practice.
Yeah, so basically the reproduction cost of the tree is a calculation method that's published by the International Society of Arboriculture. It's a process by which an arborist would determine what it would cost to replace the tree as is. It's an estimate because obviously you can't always replace a very large tree with a very large tree. It's not really practical. So it's a practical real world equation to come up with a value, a reproduction value for the tree. And so that's why it's referred to, because there's a set way to calculate it. I don't have the formula in front of me, but it is something that we could look up and share with you.
Okay, just like as an illustrative example, if there was an oak tree you might pass in the neighborhood that's 20 feet high and has a 20-inch diameter or something.
Yeah, depending on
value be like in the tens of thousands?
Yeah,
or
depending
hundreds
on
of thousands,
depending
or-
on the condition. If it was in poor condition, it might be 8 to 10,000. If it's in perfect condition and a great placement, it could be 15 to 20. It just depends on. There's a series of factors, including health, structure, size, species. So once they calculate that all out, then you can come up with a reproduction cost.
Yeah, just having that example is helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Commissioner Templeton?
Thank you so much. We're just doing technical questions now, and then we'll do public comment and opinion. Okay, so I'll save all my wonderful praise of your work for the opinion part. But you mentioned, I've got a few questions here. So you mentioned that there was a list of exemptions of trees that are non-native. Where is that?
So it is not in your packet. It's housed on our ordinance or on our website for the ordinance. The invasive species list is pulled from Cal IPC, so California Invasive Plant Council, their list, as well as a few other lists that have locally specific trees that are problematic. Included on there are high water users such as willows, birches, alders, things that use a lot of water are also exempt. The one exception is redwood. So redwood is a high water user, but it's still protected.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. Yeah, I'm, as I was reading through, I got kind of curious about the nuisance and the non-native stuff, and I started trying to follow that path. And on packet page 20, you refer to the definition of dead, hazardous, or constitutes a nuisance under 80450. And I started reading that. And I noticed that all of the nuisances were to the public structures like sidewalks and roads. And
Correct.
there was no nuisances to people enjoying their own property, people feeling safe in their homes and things like that. So is that the only kind of exemption that we have right now?
So our current nuisance language is in regards to its impact to public structures.
And where's the language around how it impacts people using their own property? Like, for example, let's say I have a patio, I sell my house, there's a root knot all over the thing, and the disabled person that buys the house from me can't use the patio anymore because it's so uneven. They want to remove the tree, can they, because of their personal needs?
Currently, we do not have a reason for removal that would meet that. If the tree met other reasons for removal, it could be removed.
Okay, so
If
is
it
that
was-
legal? It feels like, I don't know if that's something we want to talk about or flag, but if we're giving you feedback, if it's just a study session giving you feedback, I would want to make sure that it doesn't prevent a disabled person from using their own property, for example. There was other kinds of enjoyment of their property I was thinking about. So I've got, in my backyard, I've got somebody planted I was telling Doria, as a Christmas tree 100 years ago, no, maybe 80 years ago, and it's bifurcated, and it has some kind of pest that causes it to drip sap. Like, my patio is unusable because of the amount of sap. We've treated it, we've tried to do pest control. I like the tree. It's not going anywhere while I own the house, but I can imagine, it is a danger. My neighbors are worried. It's not going to follow my house, it's follow one of their houses. what recourse do they have if it's making their property unusable with the SAP, or if it's going to fall on the neighbor's house and we can't afford that kind of liability, because in California, insurance is being canceled left and right because we're having climate crises that cause our trees to fail.
So part of the reason for adding that new reason for removal with retrenchment or incompatible with its immediate environment is those two scenarios might meet that incompatible with its immediate environment.
Who decides that though?
That would be,
I mean, it's a healthy tree.
so that would be based on the arborist report and the review by our in-house staff arborist.
So the arborist will tell me if I'm allowed to use my patio or not.
No, your arborist would present a report to us explaining why the tree was incompatible with its environment. And then,
can you help me understand what about my description of that tree would qualify as incompatible with the environment?
so the tree that you mentioned that was supposed to be an excurrent tree, but it now has two main trunks, that is a potential hazard. It may not qualify as a hazard, but we could consider that incompatible with its environment if it was going to be impacting.
But not the
property.
sap, not the disease.
Depends on what's causing it. Again, it's we would have to
What if
know
it was
more
an
specifics.
oak and I had a caterpillar infestation and it was causing a body rash on my babies?
If it could be treated, then we would probably recommend treating. But I'm uncertain.
It's okay. I know I'm putting you on the spot, and I'm doing that because these are the kinds of things we're hearing from people in the community. And it's frustrating because we all have good intentions with this ordinance, right? We want to protect our canopy. Palo Alto has one of the most beautiful canopies, right? Like, we are really lucky. But we also have to understand that we're having unintended consequences. And so I'm just trying to, I'll save that part for the opinion later, but just trying to understand what the devil's in the details here and what are the details that are specified. So I don't know if this is something that staff can send out to the other commissioners, but the 8.04.050 does not have any human reasons to consider a tree a nuisance. It's all sidewalks, streets, infrastructure kind of thing. So if you wanted to look at that, maybe that's something staff can send out. Okay, I'll stop for now and hopefully come back after hearing public comment. Thank you.
City Attorney, if you would like to comment, please.
Yeah, I just want to note with respect to residents who may have disabilities and their interaction with the tree ordinance, the city has a reasonable accommodation process that applies to all city programs and policies. And so it's not something that we address on an ordinance by ordinance basis.
I'm not seeing any other lights, so I think at this time we should go to the public. Ms. Dowd, I'm sure we have people online and in the room.
Thank you, Commissioners. Good evening. My name is JP Renault, and I'm the new Executive Director of Canopy. Welcome has been here. I'm lucky to work in an organization that is so deeply connected to the people and the trees that live here. As we heard from our urban forester, the proposed red line residents have encountered this past year. We support these recommendations as they clarify several contemplate additional changes when this ordinance is still in its infancy. Be done to understand the health of drought-affected trees and where to prioritize ongoing care is stronger than ever. In every community Canopy works in, we believe changes to the ordinance beyond the proposed ones at this time stakes. We want to thank our Urban Forestry Department for their critical urban issue. As you know, Canopy has Canopy also contracts Clerk County, East Palo Alto, and Mountain View. Canopy invites and encourages communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moreno.
Severely impacted by the storms. A giant, including directly above where I was sitting with my 2-year-old at the time, into effect, and then told me, no, I could not remove it. They both told me the tree was healthy, and then it fell. And my daughter refused to sleep upstairs for reach with this ordinance. I understand the goal of protecting a healthy urban canopy. We believe that we need much more flexibility and the discretion requested by Canopy just now to allow 2 arborists arborists look at that tree and say it was fine. Tree would fall. Yes, the storms were unusual, but we have no is protecting its residents so that we don't have to face in the future. Look at more flexible approaches to encouraging our residents is a much better recipe for success. LADWP for them, and they will send you 5 trees. I know this because I did it when I was in LA. Moving away in the environmental arena from mandates and moving toward who wants it or in our park. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Next speaker.
Duma, Vice Chair Chang, Commissioners. I've been talking about trees before I've been able to have with the urban forester recently. I think he's been very open to talking to us. But I want to make very clear that I think this is table this meeting tonight. Ask staff to engage more with the community, just as JP was suggesting, I think. And I think sometimes you have to get to the gravamen, the truth of the situation. So please don't take offense, but I want to state it as neutrally as I can. I think a lot of people there was an ad hoc committee. As far as I recall, there wasn't much of an attempt to engage people who are supportive of more housing in Palo Alto. We need a more diverse community. Those people were not part of the process. And so I think the urban forester, I think the city staff, I think the commissioners are all acting in good faith. There's so much division in the world right now. I am pointing out that we got to the position in which we are today through a process that I think is fundamentally flawed. And there's some similarities between what's going on tonight and what's going on tomorrow. Changed, ordinances are being tightened, that the city is pushing with a heavy hand on everything it can do to constrain housing production, not least of which is the question about impact fees and how they affect ADUs, which I asked at the beginning of the meeting. So I would suggest that
Mr. Kelly, excuse me very much. This is not a housing item that is agendized, as he explained about ADUs and trees. So if you could continue on and use the rest of your time to talk about the tree ordinance, that would be very helpful.
My remaining 0 seconds, do I get some additional time?
What? Take another minute. Sure, go ahead, take another minute.
Okay. I'm trying to put this in a HCD, canopy, and ADUs. Cost. Eric Filseth's questions from roughly 18 months ago remain unanswered. They're not answered by the staff report. HCD, the proposal that's before you will not address the concerns of the HCD with regard to housing production, the tree ordinance. I'm sorry, I've elaborated on it in my letter to you. Canopy, we should consider a regional solution. We should consider a means by which there's not stop at the border between Palo Alto and East Palo Alto. And lastly, ADU. Respectfully, I disagree with the assistant city attorney. There should be no review by urban forestry of an ADU application, period, full stop. It is not a ministerial decision. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Next are 2 on Zoom. First is the Shield Leads. If you can unmute yourself, you have 3 minutes.
Concerns about the changes proposed to this ordinance. The proposed addition of discretionary removal for large developments is concerning. We hope you don't add it. From my reading of it, it seems as if the language is saying that any tree can be removed during a large project, so long as that removal is deemed consistent with the urban forest master plan, or that the final project would result in net tree canopy increase on the property within 15 years. So it seems like the provision is telling large developers, cut down any tree you want, so long as you tell us you'll have more trees in 15 years, or that you'll be consistent with the goals of the urban forest master plan. So with this provision, it seems like, in effect, in large developments, no tree will be safe, and effectively no other provision of this ordinance applies to large developments. This seems like it would become the only provision that would be relevant for them. Another concern we have is changes to the allowable reasons for removal of a tree, particularly the changes to the definition of protected trees. So increasing the diameter thresholds, potentially eliminating one or more specific protected native species from the list, and updating the allowable reasons for removal are all concerning for us and could reduce the amount of protected trees. And then lastly, the term structurally incompatible is a little concerning. It seems somewhat subjective, and from the discussion tonight, it seems that even a structurally sound tree could be removed just because it's oddly shaped. And ultimately, if a tree is not hazardous, it shouldn't be removed. So we hope this commission doesn't water down the ordinance, or we hope this commission doesn't recommend any provisions to water down the ordinance, and that you protect trees. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Next is Winter Dellenbach.
Go ahead, Ms. Dellenbach.
Yes, I hope that you were able to review the slide deck that I sent you, that I emailed you. I'm going to go over a couple things. I want to start off with the misperception that somehow there hasn't been public airing of this or enough review. This is the 11th public meeting, agendized, legally noticed, that there has been on this new tree ordinance. It's the first changes we've done in the tree ordinance. It was in 20 years. And this is the 11th meeting about it. So there has been plenty of chance for the public to have input. Secondly, I'm going to try to go over a few things. We have climate action goals that we're to meet in 2030, and one of them is to increase our canopy by 40% in the city of Palo Alto. And we are behind in doing that. We have to protect trees and plant more trees for climate action goals. We have a program through Canopy of planting 10,000 trees in 10 years in South Palo Alto because of the inequity between North and South Palo Alto and the number of trees. And those trees are free, and anybody who wants one can have one. I think there was a speaker that was suggesting some sort of similar program was needed. We have that program, and it's been going for a couple years. Also, it's important to remember that our big mature trees may contain 10 tons of carbon sequestered or more, depending on the size and species. Some single trees can sequester the same amount of new carbon in a year as might be contained in mid-sized trees. And we have to remain, as the LA Times said in 2021, climate change is supercharging California heat waves. Heat already kills more people in the US than hurricanes, tornadoes, and other weather events combined. Also, I'm almost done. Scientists find that trees can lower air temperature in city neighborhoods by 10 or more degrees. That's the New York Times. Trees reduce electricity demand for air conditioning, sparing money and emissions. And carefully positioned trees can reduce a home's energy costs by 25%, according to the U.S. Department of Energy. Finally, proximity to urban trees is critical for interruption of climate change and for human health, UC Davis. Thank you. If we're going to be serious about climate change, we need to protect the trees we have and plant more. This is serious stuff. Thank you.
Thank you. Was that our final speaker?
Yes, that concludes public comment.
Awesome. I will bring it back to the commission, and I see a light from Commissioner Heckman.
Thank you, Chair. So I've got a lot of questions, but I thought I would wait to start them until after I heard the public comment, see if any of the public commenters raised similar questions or answered questions. But Chair, because I have so many, when I get to about 5 minutes, will you just let me know and I'll just stop and pick up in a second round?
Yes.
All right, thank you. So the first question, three months ago or so, we had a project here as a single family home. I think it was the Los Trincos project. And one of the issues that came up in our dialogue was some kind of oak disease, some threat to the trees on that property. And I think Mr. Gollinger, you were maybe participated in that. And we ended up with a condition for, I can't remember what it was, like when soil is brought to the property, right, it has to be clean or something. And I expressed concerns at that meeting that this should be really done not on an individual project basis. We should have a policy citywide. And so the first question is this, as we're looking at revisions to this ordinance, is this ordinance a good place to consider that kind of policy?
I would think the better place for those kind of guidelines would be in the tree technical manual.
Okay.
The tree and landscape technical manual that's forthcoming.
Okay, and is that being worked on by staff currently?
It is.
Okay, and are you, and I'm sorry, remind me, what was the name of that disease or?
So I believe it's sudden oak death.
Sudden oak death, okay. And is that something that the staff is trying to build into the manual?
We do have a small section. We'd like to expand it, but it is in progress.
Great, okay. All right, next question. The ordinance talks about obtaining an urban forester tree removal permit. What's the cost for that permit? Is it dependent upon the size of the tree?
No, a public works tree removal permit for a protected tree removal there's two costs associated with that. One would be unless the tree is completely dead, you would need an arborist report, and then you would submit a fee when you do your application. I believe it's currently just under $500.
Okay, all right. Plus the permit fee, $500, the arborist report. Is that there's probably a range of cost for that?
There's a range. It depends on the size of the tree and how much time it takes them to review.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, next question. Let's see. You don't need to go there, but one of the slides showed that certain trees are protected based on the size of their diameter. So one group at 11.5 inches, one group at 18, and one group at 15. Where did those particular figures come from, and why did we select those? You showed us a slide earlier that different municipalities have used different, some smaller, none larger than 18 from the slide.
Correct. The 11.5 inches is what we were protecting native oaks at under our old ordinance. And so we chose to maintain that for our native trees that we added. We kept them all at 11.5 inches. The 15-inch mature tree, that was discussed at length. Originally, it was larger than smaller, and that was kind of a compromise as to, we felt 12 inches might be going a little bit too small. So 15 was where we compromised. The 18 inches for redwoods has been in the ordinance since before the update.
Okay, thank you. How am I doing on time, Chair? Okay, so now I've got some, now I'm in the ordinance section of our staff report, and I have some questions as I work my way through from front to back. On packet page 16, definition of buildable area, definition number 2 is necessary for construction of primary access. And then the second sentence, to which a little bit's been added, on single family home parcels, the portion of the parcel deemed to be the buildable area for primary access shall not exceed 10 feet in width. So my question was, are we talking there about a 10-foot wide driveway? Is that what we're talking about?
I believe we added that to be to conform with other definitions of that elsewhere in the ordinance.
Okay, so I mean, for example, my house has a 2-car garage, and it has a driveway that's 20 feet wide, I think, because that's the standard width of a 2-car garage. So I'm concerned that this is a constraint, because I think it's saying that well, I don't understand how I need 20 feet, I need a 20-foot driveway, but only 10 foot is considered buildable area. I think that should be looked at. All right, one more and then I'll pass it on. And this is the top of page 17. So it's the definition of drip line area. So the drip line here is defined as either the outer edge of the canopy, which of course is when the rain falls. That's literally where the line of drips happens. Or it's 10 times the diameter of the trunk, 54 inches up, whichever is greater. Why do we need that second part? Why isn't the drip line the actual drip line?
Because some trees, such as redwoods and other conical trees, do not have a very wide drip line, yet their critical root zone would extend out farther. So,
okay, there are other, that's very helpful. I guess I'm going to suggest that perhaps we should be a little more specific. Because again, I don't know how the unintended consequences, I don't know how the numbers play out here. So we need to protect the place where the water comes down to the redwood, but we don't want to, an oak, for example, if using these numbers is going to push it out, in all directions 10 feet below where the roots are, that's not really what we're trying to do. And so I would suggest that maybe we can look at that and make that second part applicable to those trees where the root structure naturally extends past the canopy. That's just a suggestion. All right, I'm going to leave it there and come back with another round.
Commissioner Aiken?
Thank you, Chair. So I'm very supportive of the intent here. So the concerns I'm going to express are not necessarily mine personally, but they are important. This is related to whether the tree protection ordinance constitutes a constraint on housing production. So I went back to read the HCD response letters, and of course they call this out explicitly in several places. And many of their comments, I think, were prompted by Palo Alto Forward's public comments. So I went back to read those as well. And I'm curious as to whether you went back through those materials in order to have an explicit response to each of the issues that were raised there. I noted, for example, that Palo Alto Forward's estimate for reproduction cost is about somewhere between a factor of 5 and 10 higher than you described to us just a few minutes ago. So there may be disconnect there, but at least there needs to be a response to the concerns that were brought up. Looking at the potential additions here, I see some things that might have been intended to address those, but I wondered, did you go through them all and make sure they were all covered?
No, I haven't been through all of those. We did have a meeting with Planning and Development Management, and they included some of those proposed changes for those projects of 4 more units. We did create an exemption for ADUs. So any Table 1 ADUs are not required to comply with the majority of the ordinance. So they're exempt from needing a tree preservation report. We're only asking them to disclose trees, and that's it.
Okay. I hesitate to speak for the other groups, but I think there was a lot of concern about multifamily construction. So that case may be the most important. Related to that, our preservation ordinance is not at all inconsistent with what our neighboring cities are specifying. So have they had similar comments from HCD regarding whether their urban forest rules constitute a constraint on production? This may be a question for other staff. I don't know.
I'm not aware of what Mountain Views has received or surrounding jurisdictions. But we could certainly look into that and be aware of that for next opportunity.
Yeah, it might be nice to know is, do we have a principled response to the concerns that have been raised? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Chang.
Yes, so I had some questions about the 25% rule being added to, as referred to on packet page 9. And so I just wanted to look, because we're now adding the 25% rule to single family and RMD, et cetera. But I wanted to ask what this twice the reproduction cost or 10% of the project valuation means in the context of, say, a single family home. In other words, for a big development, like having an architect review the plans, that might, and modify them a little bit, might not make that much difference in the total project cost. But for a single family home, having to redo things for a tree might result in an entirely, like a brand new redesign. And having just gone through a remodel myself, I know that these things can get quite expensive. Similarly, if there's a change, it's really hard to get that quoted out. Like I couldn't even get contractors to respond to me. I can't, so, it's like contact 40, 5 respond. And so I'm wondering in this situation, practically, what documentation is required? Like, I think it's a really nice idea, but I'm wondering, and I had a concern just for all the low density housing, single family home, these smaller parcels with a big tree on them, like practically, is this not very feasible for a homeowner to do? So I wanted, was there any thought given to what that means in terms of documentation?
So regarding application of those exemptions, what we've encountered is generally the builder and the arborist discuss options and then explain why those options aren't feasible. We haven't encountered a specific example where they've needed to provide the actual cost. What's happened is they'll get together and say, well, we could do this, but this would save the tree, but it's not practical because X, Y, and Z. And so once they explain that they've gone through all the potential options, then that's been enough to satisfy us in those instances. We haven't come across one where we've said, we need to see the numbers.
So I guess now that we're expanding it to like a whole different, I think I like the idea in principle. I like making clear what this is, but by putting such specific numbers in here, it sort of makes it seem as if this is more than just a conversation. So that's just some feedback. I'm not quite sure how to solve it. Mm-hmm. The other piece that I wonder about is, does this create this bizarre kind of moral hazard like problem where somebody's like, well, there's a giant tree in my lot. I could design around it. I could. But if I just go ahead and do my design expecting that it's going to be torn down, like I can create a situation where it would be more than 10% of the cost of the project. And therefore I can take my tree down. And so that's just another thing that I want to be, that's assuming nefarious purposes by a property, nefarious goals of a property owner, but having it all laid out like this and kind of thinking about how much my architect cost as a percentage of the cost of my house, it's not hard to get to 10%. So that's just feedback again. Mm-hmm. That's it for now. I'm sure I have more.
Okay. Commissioner Liu?
Thank you. I had a few questions around fees and penalties, really just trying to think about when this actually becomes an impediment to housing. So on page 22, part like kind of bullet A in the middle, it talks about once a tree is removed, there could be replacement trees. On what those in lieu fees might actually look like, and or what the combination of those have actually looked like in recent projects.
Yes, so if a project is required, let's use, for example, let's say either 2 trees with in lieu fees. Our in lieu fees are currently calculated at $650 for one 24-inch box tree. And that is an S to a street tree. And that is currently where we are. That includes water for the first 2 years. It's the whole thing. And we reevaluate that every about 5 years.
Then charge an ultimately reasonable in lieu fee that's not going to be into the tens of thousands of dollars.
Correct.
Okay.
Now, if it's a very large project and they ended up needing 20 replacement trees, but they could only plant 5, then it's going to be a little more expensive, but it's still, it's per 24-inch box tree. So there's no scale to that.
Or maybe it was 26, or there were administrative penalties. And I guess some level of discretionary penalties. Can you talk a little bit about what that has actually looked like in practice?
So we still have not make. We've had updates to the administrative penalty list ready to go. It just hasn't ever made it to council. So it would be more in line with what's in the ordinance as opposed to right now, our administrative penalty.
Administrative penalty list is one list of all the penalties, and it gets updated all at one time.
Correct. And these would be penalties that would be assessed by city staff with the issuance of a violation notice.
Okay. Ballpark range of what the fee is, or where it might range, or where it might land, because of the fee is disproportionately impactful.
I can jump in briefly here. So there's 2 different things we're talking about here. One is administrative penalties per day, because each day can be considered a separate violation until something is cured. That's where there's some discretion that falls on staff whether to apply something as a daily penalty or as a single penalty per occurrence. And then you can seek from a court in the event we have to take someone to court under this ordinance. But those civil penalties are different from what we would do just issuing citations.
Okay, got it. That's helpful context. Can you also talk a little bit about the potential 36-month moratorium and how that
outside of development? And most commonly, let's say the reason for removal was damage to a foundation or eaves of an existing residence. We would definitely want to impose the moratorium at that point, because we wouldn't want somebody to remove a tree because it's damaging an existing house and then completely remove the house that it was damaging. So basically they use that as a reason for removal, but then chose to completely remodel the house in which the tree would have survived if they would have built around the tree. So that's primarily what it's there for. It would also be applied in issues or scenarios where trees are dead and they might be dead due to neglect. So people would previously under the old ordinance, people would purposefully stop watering their trees. The trees would die, they would remove them, and then they'd file for a permit. So this is intended to not penalize people, but prevent them from taking advantage of that.
Okay. I can see how in practice it could become a non-trivial penalty though. So do we typically just say 36 months is standard, or do we usually give much lighter moratoriums?
Currently, we've only been issuing 36-month. There is room for changing that. Right now, we do have a method for removal. If they seek removal, we examine the situation and suggest some additional mitigation measures that would allow them to remove it. So that would mean planting of more trees.
Okay. maybe a couple of more questions. This one's potentially for the city attorney. On packet page 21, point C, there's a discussion about subdivision of land into 2 lots and how you could remove trees for access purposes. Some elaboration of that would be great, but I'd also just be curious how that works with SB 9 and state laws that fast track or otherwise accelerate lot splits. Yeah, on 21, middle of the page, there's bullet C, and then underneath that, there's bullet 1 talking about how removal is acceptable if it restricts access to the property.
Yeah, so if you have a piece of land and you're subdividing it, and to develop 2 or more individual parcels, and just due to the shape of the parcel of the lots, the only feasible place to put a driveway or private street or something would require removal of a tree. This would be an acceptable reason for removal. I don't think we have encountered this in terms of SB 9 yet, but I think it would be a similar analysis would take place is, if the lot split that's being proposed, you have a flagpole for a rear lot or something like that, and necessarily would require removal of the tree, then we would allow removal of that tree.
Okay. Yeah, it seems like there are many ways that trees could restrict access in a lot split. Like even if it's just in the middle of the fence, sometimes you could possibly build the fence around it. Other times you could just say that's kind of inconvenient for this lot split, or it's kind of restricting access for this fence or something. Would you still consider maybe marginal cases like that as restricting access?
So I think when this ordinance refers to access, restricted access, we're talking about a driveway or like the entrance, the ability to get to the property. So something like fence placement wouldn't factor in.
Okay. And my last question is, I guess the language on ADUs is not in this ordinance, but can you give a quick update on how sweeping that is? Is that just a blanket statement that ADUs are generally able to remove protected trees without replacement or in lieu or anything like that?
Yeah, so that language was added into chapter 1809. And let's see. I just need to find it. So there are 2 sets of ADUs that we address in chapter 1809. One is the sort of state mandated ministerial approval ADU. And for those ADUs, all that we require is a tree disclosure statement. So just a statement telling us what trees are on the property. Permit the property owner to fill out that disclosure statement, where normally we would require an arborist. So for an ADU, the property owner can just make a note of what are the trees that are on the property, how large they are, et cetera. For larger ADUs that aren't where compliance with the tree ordinance. So if you're trying to build a 1,000 square foot ADU as opposed to an 800 square foot ADU, you would need to show us that the
answers.
Thank you. Commissioner Templeton.
Thank you very much. So I'm appreciate all the comments that my fellow commissioners have made. I do appreciate I also think your new email alias is adorable. trees@cityofpaloalto.org for anyone who wants to write about trees. Are good comments to consider. It is new and therefore imperfect, and so we're gonna do our best to. But as Mr. Leeds from the Sierra Club representative said, there's or open it, but it's imprecise in a way that's going to make it hard to 80450 and partly answer my own question, and that's why this is misleading. This subpoint I at the top of page 20. Because it doesn't allow hazardous or where our other public commenter, Ms. Rusin came in, right? She had a private nuisance and a private hazard on her property that was not remediable option. And I think about that for other people who are not trying to remove who are not gaming the system, as Vice Chair Chang said. They're just trying to figure out how to make from this part. Number one needs another bullet, and the bullet needs to talk about private nuisances as well, or exceptions for private, right? We want to have the flexibility to keep this intent going without causing people to be frustrated or unsafe in their own homes. So I think it's not a small piece of feedback, and I don't think we can craft it for you here, but I encourage you and the city to think about the personal impact here. We're not talking infrastructure, we're talking houses, we're talking, women holding their basement. Hear about a tree breaking in a tennis court while school is being let out. That could have gone really bad. So we want to have the flexibility to have public safety and private safety to be a consideration. So on the other side of the coin, it's going to horrify you guys, I'm worried, but any dead, diseased, infested, or dying tree in any street. I assume that includes the whole property if it's on a street in Palo Alto. Dead and diseased, infested. Every oak tree in Palo Alto is infested with those moth larvae. Those are the poisonous caterpillars that cause the rash. Are they eligible? They are, according to this. So the way it's written has a huge loophole. As you mentioned before, I could take my very healthy, beautiful fir tree in my backyard, and too. We've got wires holding those trunks together, but it could be taken down for those reasons too, because of the way it's currently worded. So it's tough feedback, but if our intention is to protect trees, we have to be more specific.
That might be referencing public trees only.
Okay, if it is, we are missing an entire thing about how to treat private property.
Understood.
Even though we're trying to enforce it on private property, which is the issue that was brought up by our public commenter. So it's tough. We want to take what we've already written and try and apply it more broadly, but there's some dangers in doing that. Okay, so the other thing, let's see if I can find it. It was something Mr. Leeds said. It'll come to me later. I'll stop here for now, but if we were voting and we didn't have something to address these matters of how to treat trees on private property and covering these loopholes in a compassionate, fair way that maintains promotes our canopy, it wouldn't be.
Commissioner Rekdal?
Can you talk about your GIS data that you use to measure the canopy?
So yes, we recently acquired the canopy module for Tree Plotter. So Tree Plotter is one of our tree inventory softwares that we use. It's shared with Canopy and has a public interface. And it uses satellite data and spectral imagery to calculate the canopy percentage based on neighborhoods all the way down to parcels.
Or is there a person in the loop?
It gives you actual visual data overlay for the whole city, but it doesn't isolate individual trunks. So it doesn't identify individual trees. It gives you an overall picture of the canopy.
Okay, so you know the area that's covered by canopy, but you don't know how many trees it is.
Correct.
And then like on slide 18, where it gives all these numbers, were these numbers from GIS? And notice on top it says several different calculation methods.
Correct. So there is it's referenced on the report. So Greg McPherson wrote an excellent paper in 2017, and it gave multiple methods for calculating the total number of trees within any given urban environment. And so we took several different calculation methods that were included in there, applied them to our data, and came up with this as a best estimate for how many trees were in the city.
So this is starting with the GIS data, or?
No, this started with actual inventory data collected from development projects.
Okay.
So we went through and pulled the inventory data that was supplied to us over several years of projects.
So how accurate are the numbers on slide 18? 10%, or is it plus or minus 50%? That's.
I don't think it's quite that far off. There is definitely some room for error, but I wouldn't be able to give you an exact percentage. I'd have to go back and look at how we ran the calculations.
Just curious. One of the callers mentioned about the climate action goal, increasing the canopy by 40%.
It was not increasing by 40%. It was increasing to 40% coverage by 2030.
Okay, and what is the current coverage?
I'd have to look. We're in the low 30s.
Okay.
Probably like 32.
That's still a pretty big increase. Is that feasible?
It's going to be difficult. We were making some good progress, and I think we've kind of backslid in recent years. I have to dive in and do a little closer look with the data. We've only recently gained access to this data in the last few weeks, so we haven't really had time to crunch the numbers.
Most of the canopy growth, do you think it's on private land or on public land?
So it's a mixture of both. Again, we haven't really got a chance to analyze the data yet. We're mostly validating, making sure the numbers are accurate. But overall, it looks like where we've lost canopy on the couple samples we've taken are places where we've had development projects, and there are more trees coming. We know there were projects 5 years ago, and see where we are if we're increasing in those areas. And again, this is just something that's going to take us time to dive into, and we really haven't had a chance to analyze it yet.
So if someone pays an in lieu fee to remove a tree, we take that money. You mentioned street trees. Is that
correct?
Typically where we plant those?
That's how the fee is calculated. So it goes into our forestry fund, and the forestry fund is used by staff to plant trees, and it's also used to contract out planting of trees. Canopy does some tree planting for us. Previously, we've done some tree planting with some of our other contractors as well. We don't currently have another contract right now.
And do we have any programs to plant trees that aren't funded by that in lieu fees in addition to that?
Well, our regular street tree program just replaces trees as they're removed, and we have vacancies. So that's just an internal, we're trying to keep our vacancy number low as far as empty planting sites.
And so there we're just kind of treading water though, because we're just replacing trees, street trees that die, and then we replace it.
Correct.
So if we're trying to grow the canopy, we'll have to find new locations.
Correct.
And would that be in parks or in open space, or what would be?
Primarily, it would be on private property at this point. We do have some public right of way that could be planted. A lot of the places where we don't have trees planted are due to underground infrastructure, or other issues where we've had unsuccessful plantings in the past. And so we need to regroup and find out why 3 trees have failed in one location. It's probably a soil issue. But as far as parks go, our parks need to have open spaces as well as plantings. So it's a delicate balance with whether or not we have room for a substantial amount of trees in our parks. And we work with our parks group. They're a great partner with us, and they help us identify new planting locations. But I don't know if it's I don't know if we have a room for large quantity more trees.
Yeah, I would think if we were trying to increase from 32 up to 40, we're gonna have to find a lot of spaces. Okay, also slide 14, which is the non-residential projects. Can you talk about this change on slide 14?
Yes, so this is an attempt to capture discretion that has been exercised
Could you
over
just
time.
pull it up for us so that we can also see slide 14?
So these would be projects that would go through the discretionary approval process. And we were always under the impression that
14.
Yeah, 14. And during the preparation for the 22 update to the ordinance, this was discussed multiple times. And we felt that the discretion required to review and approve larger projects was included in Title 18. After the ordinance was passed and we had some additional questions and concerns, we took a deeper dive into Title 18, and it was not explicitly granted the discretion that we had been using on these types of projects. So this is an attempt to capture that.
Okay, so we're not changing policy,
we're trying to codify it.
Okay. And do you have any concerns about this? That one of the callers mentioned this.
Again, this is something that we've done in the past. When we review a project, it has to make sense. We're not going to sign off on a wholesale removal of trees, but if removing a few select trees and replanting them makes sense in the long term, then that's what this is here for. Maybe those few select trees wouldn't qualify under other portions of the ordinance, but because it's a large discretionary project that's going through that whole long planning approval process, we felt that discretion was included in Title 18, but we discovered it wasn't. So this is an attempt to capture that.
Okay, and now this slide says that non-residential projects
This would include probably large multifamily projects. It would be non-R1, R2, anything not single family.
Okay, so if I'm building a big apartment complex and there's a protected tree there, I can go through the discretionary process, get that removed to build a larger apartment complex, and then
would be considered.
Plant
Yeah.
additional trees.
Depending on the final outcome of the project, that would be considered, yes.
Okay, I mean, talking about the HCD, I would want to make that clear to HCD that the fact that you have a protected tree will not prevent you from.
Correct, and that's partly, we had been operating under those parameters previously, but it wasn't captured. So this is an attempt to capture that.
Okay.
There is some flexibility when we're going through that long discretionary planning approval process. We don't, depending on the project.
Okay, I want to talk about exceptions. The exceptions talk about damage to houses or eaves. What about driveways?
We currently do not allow removal of protected tree for damage to a driveway.
Yeah, see, I had a tree that went under my fence, and we'll take it out, and I would have felt like just a terrible neighbor. It just did a number on her driveway. And it seems that that would be a reasonable spot to take a tree out and replant something, but take it out.
It's possible that our proposed.
The thing about exceptions is that if you hand them out left, right, and center, then
Correct.
You don't have an ordinance anymore.
And that's why it was previously limited to the foundation or eaves of a residence.
But yet I would have felt like a terrible neighbor. Commissioner Templeton talked about sap dropping on your patio. And, there's no exception that would allow you to take that, or would that be also incompatible to your surroundings?
it doesn't meet any of the qualifications currently for removal.
Okay.
But I have 8.4 in front of me because I only printed out 8.10. So my apologies.
Yeah. For me, the trees is a quality of life issue. If I walk down a shady street, my life is a lot more enjoyable. My walk is a lot more enjoyable if I'm a citizen with the quality of life of the city. And it'd be different if you're cutting down this tree and just concreting it over. But if you're going to say, oh, I want to cut down this tree, it's incompatible. The whole new trees to replace that to me seems like a reasonable approach. It helps the person's quality of life, but yet in the long run doesn't affect the neighbors.
Well, and that was actually brought up in the Parks and Rec meeting as well, was that we consider a deadline, but that is something we're considering.
Okay, I would recommend that we look because I think this has to evolve, and I think that's one area where it could evolve because if
folks to address those without writing a blank check for every removal. Exactly. That's what we're trying to accomplish.
Okay, thank you.
For what I think is a very measured and thoughtful update to our tree ordinance, which was way over 20 years. It was 27 years or something since it was updated. And we quite understand why the nuisance only pertains to in that way. So I'm not quite sure where the problem in the code is, but if that's actually that we had trees fall in those catastrophic storms. And I agree that we'll have more of those kinds of storms. Sometimes even a healthy tree is going to fall under those kinds of conditions. So we can't eliminate all the risk. But we do know staff made since a year ago were to broaden the removal too far, and we should back that up. So I think this hits a good middle ground, not that some of the suggestions of my colleague with the old ordinance could be removed. I think it is entirely, it's a huge protecting and emphasizing the benefits of native trees over exotics really does. I think it's Quercus agrifolia. Some years that happens and everybody's tree in the area has those moths. Quercus agrifolia is much smaller, so but there's times when you can't walk through Stanford campus because they're all over you. I don't think we can address parameters of our tree ordinance. In general, and I think Commissioner Aiken made a very good comment. We have not really ordinance of any of the cities around us. It's kind of in the middle. And as someone who worked at all of the cities, if the HCD letter is city attorney adequately explained that you can't just the property, but there's an overriding law in the state law about ADUs. I am convinced that beyond the concerns that you've heard from Parks and Rec and us tonight, that you have got this further clarified in our tree ordinance. I think that further polarizes information in an unscientific and not very practical manner coming and will be mostly successful. And if there are tweaks you need to make after hearing all the concerns, then I think you should make them. I'm not sure they will come back to this body because the process was a little unclear. So anything you want to say, you should definitely, and I am fully supportive with any changes that need to be made. And with that, I will go to Commissioner Chang.
Thank you. Yeah, I also want to echo, I just think that the work that's been done, I really appreciate all the work that staff has done and how carefully staff has listened to feedback, gathered the data, and tried to address that feedback. In line with what surrounding cities have done, it's not, I think it brings us up to par with other cities. Without it, we would actually look terrible. And it's kind of an embarrassment and a stain on our Tree City USA to have an ordinance that was doing, like when you really examine it, such a shoddy job of protecting trees compared to every surrounding municipality. My heart goes out to our public commenter who experienced having large trees around is that they fall. I have a friend who also, because of the crazy storms last year, had a tree fall in Tahoe on her home. And so the only way, and there's all healthy trees that are falling, but that's because it's such a rare storm. And yes, they're going to large trees that can fall. And I don't think that's what we want. And so I don't, it's also why tree falling is insured by homeowners insurance. It's why, fires, you can't have homes without having the risk of fires that will burn. Address those problems is to address climate change more broadly. And I think that our trees, having them actually on balance, helps the problem. And so I do think that we need to do some tweaks, because if the city had deemed that there were public nuisances for which trees needed to be taken down, there are most certainly private nuisances. And so we need to tweak there. I would look to surrounding cities for what they do, because they we might not have to reinvent the wheel. There may be things that work quite well. It might be not as complicated a problem as we might think. I think we should look around and copy heavily if we think it would solve our problems. And then as I looked at sort of the number of, so it's only been in place for a year. In that year, we had 100-year storms come in. So I think it would be rash to do much more than what staff has put in place, aside from the various comments that we've all commented on. I would like, if you look at 225,000 protected trees, and we've had how many fall down on a house? I think that we're doing pretty good here. It's really phenomenal, actually. And that to me actually is a sign that we've done a pretty good job taking care of our trees, that we need to continue taking care of our trees so that they don't fall down, and that our tree ordinance is probably right. That because there were lots of trees that went down, and the fact that we had so little damage to homes is actually good. And then it's evidence of how good our ordinance is, actually. And then finally, let me see, I'm reading my notes here. Oh, I was really pleased about the codification of the current practices, because I'm hoping that does address some HCD concerns. Yeah, again, I think we, in today, when everything is such a lightning rod for polarization, I think we need to take things at face value. This tree ordinance brings us up to par with surrounding municipalities. There's nothing nefarious about it. And so I'm really pleased, we have a way to take down trees that are a problem. Making explicit the 25% rule for smaller lots is good. And so I think that we're in the right, this is in the right direction. We just need to tweak it here and there. Thank you.
Commissioner Templeton.
Thank you. I have just a couple of quick follow-ups, and absolutely, it does come and go, but I just don't want it to be exploited. If somebody has 1 year has a random bad infestation of the caterpillars, it's not an excuse to take your oak tree down, right? Like, it's just it is an act of God, right, in that way, but it's also exploitable. And I think that was my main point. Insurance, Vice Chair Chang mentioned insurance. You mentioned fire insurance. Many of the major carriers have stopped insuring homes in fire zones for that. And I think that was the point of bringing it up tonight, is is that going to happen to us because we are somehow making ourselves more prone to tree damage on our properties by, I don't know, being super pro tree, which we are in the city. I don't know how to look at that, except to understand who has the liability. So if the city refuses to let a tree be removed and something happens to someone's property, who's liable? Right? That's a question that we have to think about as a city in terms of how restrictive we are.
Yeah, and also there is an appeal process about tree decisions, which is just our standard appeal process. We didn't really talk about that, but I thought it was a good time to interject.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Whether or not we've had significant or minimal amount of damage to homes last year, I'm not sure I've seen that data. The anecdotal data I've seen was everybody I knew in Palo Alto was posting pictures of some kind of tree damage on their fence, on their car, on their, can't get in and out of their driveway because a tree fell across it. Like, I know that it's not every one of them, but it was more than the couple that we've heard about tonight. We do have the penalties. We have the stick in terms of thou shalt not remove trees. Do we want to include the carrot? Do we want to have anything in here that incentivizes people to plant more trees? I don't know if we do, but I am the beneficiary of a canopy tree in my property and very, very pleased about that. I love that we have a program in Palo Alto with a nonprofit partner that we can add more trees. It didn't cost me a dime and it was installed free of charge. So that's a really great thing. I don't know if we need to write that down. And then my last comment was about the moratorium of building when a tree dies or is removed. The edge case I'm thinking about is somebody who loves their beloved cherry tree, which finally reached 100 and dropped dead. They have to wait 3 years to do something that they waited the natural life of the tree. It's a rare edge case, but it just not sure, how firm we need to be on certain cases. We need to think about that edge case as well. Thank you.
Commissioner Liu?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the updates here. I really appreciate having a strong tree ordinance, but I especially appreciate the extra flexibility that we're getting in these updates. Before getting into more comments, I had kind of a combination question/comment. Trying to clarify something that Commissioner Rechtel was asking about the tree ordinance for discretionary larger projects. Just so I definitely understand, on the bottom of packet page 21 on point 3, when it talks about discretionary development approval, I understand the point about increased canopy coverage, like the other condition of or replacement of trees, shrubs, and plants consistent with the urban forester master plan goals. That can all happen offsite?
Ideally, the majority of it would be happening on site.
Okay.
So with all projects, we want to encourage replacement on site as much as possible.
Okay, but it could be offsite.
Some portion of it could be offsite.
Okay. All right, I'm trying to reconcile that with, I guess, a potential suggestion in the slides that was, or maybe in the packet that was talking about how we could potentially add an exemption for like a density reduction of 5% or greater. The ordinance in general, we have the tree replacement provisions like right below that. If you ever remove a protected tree, we would have tree replacement in general. And so if one of the conditions is that discretionary approval can be approved if it provides replacement trees, then that's almost like saying discretionary development can just remove any trees as long as they provide replacements on.
Intent of this. For instance, it's not codified here, but we could, the project could be removing some invasive trees that provide canopy, and they're replacing it with more appropriate drought tolerant canopy for that.
Yeah, I think that's fine. from my perspective, I just want to confirm. So we have a discretionary project, we approve it, they remove some protected trees. We adding exemption for a redesign that requires density reductions of 5% or greater wouldn't really come up because you would have to replace those trees. And generally, it's just like a very flexible provision, basically, is what we're saying, that you can add trees offsite. And that seems like a pretty flexible catch-all way where developers can
plant offsite to replace trees. That was not the intent of what's written here.
Okay.
The intent was that the project itself gets specifying.
Yeah, I would definitely encourage that, but also I do not mind giving ways. I think I was not trying to say, okay, sorry. Okay. Okay, a couple more comments. So I think that seems very long, and long, just shortening that or being more explicit about the flexibility we can provide. I also agree with some other commissioners that the exemption gives private property owners more flexibility. I would also want to be much more clear and strong about the ADU exemption. That ADUs make sense, but I would like to see this extended to other ADUs as much as we reasonably can, or preferably just, I would consider tweaking the numbers, I guess. Like, I think in the reasonable, it's just it's still a reasonable bar for a oh, and on the, there was a discussion of either 2x the replacement value or 10% of the given property valuation, whichever is greater. I think it's also reasonable to just say whichever. Yeah, I generally see reasons to be more flexible on the 25% rule. And those.
Thank you. And I also want to join the other commissioners in thanking staff for the work on the ordinance, for the work on tracking the ordinance over the last year, and for to improve it during what's kind of a trial period for a lot of changes that were made a year ago. So I'm going to continue through the ordinance. Toward the bottom of the page, exempted under a certain section may be protected as a designated tree. And so that language may be suggests discretion to me. Need to explain, if it is discretion, how that process will work. So again, a homeowner reading this ordinance needs to be able to track the path. Next is on packet page 19, kind of in the middle of the page, 810, sort of a standard. Now we're going to, this is requiring that we show on the plans all trees with a 4-inch diameter. So my first question is, where'd the 4-inch come from?
That's something that we've been asking for when a project as far as disclosure goes.
Okay.
It's not referencing protection, it's just referencing what's there.
Okay. And in fact, I was kind of surprised that we're talking about 4-inch, every tree that's 4 inches. And so I went to look at the definitions to look for definition of tree. But my reading of this ordinance, because the ordinance doesn't say a eucalyptus tree isn't a tree, I think on my plan, I have to show all of my 4-inch plus eucalyptus, right?
Correct, because
Okay.
eucalyptus is exempt from protection, but it's still a tree.
Okay, and I think that it would make sense. It makes sense to me if we want to develop our database on future protected trees. That would make sense to me. And so a standard here like 9-inch redwood diameter, right? That would make more sense to me here, because those are the ones we're ultimately going to protect. We want to track those as they get bigger. We want to know if we're near the top of the page in section A1, the last line uses the word feasible. There's at least, I think, one other place I saw here where that's something that maybe staff should look at. And again, I'm because it's a study session, I'm just kind of giving feedback of, things that you may want to investigate in cleaning up the ordinance. Okay. Gorgeous twin redwood. It is protected. And if it falls on my house, it will demolish my house. Thankfully, it's in great shape. But if it were diseased, the concept that having done that, I had a development moratorium on my property for 36 months. That's not how it works?
No, it's not every permit. So if the arborist report proved that your code, it's may be applied, the moratorium may be applied. So we apply it to instances where the reason for removal has to do with the existing property. So for instance, damage to a foundation or eaves of an existing residence, apply the moratorium. A tree falls over in the storm, tree's rotten, tree has structural issues, there would be no moratorium for those instances.
Okay, so that's not want a property owner to fear getting a permit because for a diseased tree, because they don't want the moratorium, because they're planning to remodel, whatever. So clarify that, and a protected tree without a permit.
It's included in that section as well. So there's a separate section about violations. Yeah.
Okay. So I think this, and a couple of the commissioners have commented on this. I just think this should be simplified. I don't think we should be sort of adding more past the reproduction costs of the tree, and we shouldn't sort of have this, the greater of that. If I've got a big project, I've got to equally to different properties, and I don't think that's fair. So I would suggest in the middle of the page, subpart 4, which is some new language, add the word existing before foundation, right? Because I think that'll be more consistent. Had 2 subparts, now has 3. And so in the last line of D, before you get to, so change either to any in subpart. There's the shaded last sentence. So that was weird because it's shaded, but it's not underlined. So is that added, or is it?
Rule could apply to multiple protected trees impacting the buildable area, not just a singular tree. The trees that had tree protection zones impacting the buildable area, whereas historically this has been used for singular, large, centrally located trees.
Okay.
It could also apply to more than one tree.
So those are the new, I think we need to hear effort to do things with their property. I think that's really critical information. I do this ordinance because I think that is, as a number of the commissioners have referenced, constraints on the reasonable living in. And I think that citizens and so I think that that I've heard a number of my fellow commissioners raise tonight. So in at that, so we still maintain control over out of, because the ordinance doesn't have that relief valve.
In general, I think this tree ordinance is definitely an ordinance that expands in there before is spelled out. And it also health for our residents comes from. So I also think it does something really good, which the maintenance is by the example of Commissioner Reckdahl's tree, because I know that root extended into your neighbor's yard, roots can be trimmed from, and I think a lot of, I don't think because more the policy. And so I think those ideas were included in the tree technical manual even before, and they will be there now. This is the broader situation, but I know many situations where significant tree roots were trimmed. And I want to end up by thanking Canopy also for the tremendous amount of good work they've, and I want to once again ask, thanks. That concludes, unless anyone has anything else to add this item. I have stuck around